thank you very much, Dick, for agreeing to do this interview about your meetings that you've had over many years with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I know that you were at the March on Washington on August 27th, 1963,
63.
but you had many other meetings with Dr. King. And I would like you to share your first meeting with Dr. King and the circumstances of it.
Geneva, well, there are some advantages to being 150 years old. You get called upon to do things like this, which I think are very important. I first met Dr. King when I was going south in 1958. In college at the University of New Hampshire, I did a paper on the aftermath of the Montgomery bus boycott several years earlier. And it occurred to me in midwinter, the paper would be more intelligently written if I could actually have interviews with the people that were involved in the bus boycott. So I hitchhiked south, went to Montgomery, interviewed a bunch of people, and I was fortunate to be able to have an interview with Dr. King in Atlanta after my Montgomery visit. So my first visit with Dr. Martin Luther King was at the Ebenezer Baptist Church at 1 o'clock in the afternoon in March of 1958, in March of 1958. And at the time, I was so naive, I was in my young 20s. It didn't occur to me that just having a meeting with Dr. King was such an important thing. I was just on my little assignment as a college student. Naivete goes a long way in places like that. In any case, I was in the waiting room and the secretary said, Dr. King will see you now. And I walked down the little hallway and out of this room came this short guy who I was taller than he was, and I'm only 5'9". And he was of slight build and he reached out his hand and he said, welcome, Dick. And I was kind of flabbergasted. His picture had been on the front of Time magazine a few weeks earlier. And here I was shaking his hand. It was a little bit above my pay grade. So we walked into the office and I then pulled out my little yellow pad with my 15 questions. And I was about ready to interview him. And then he decided he would interview me. So for the first 15 minutes of our time together, I sat across from him. He was behind his desk. And in this quiet Southern voice, he would ask me questions. What made you interested in the boycott? What are you going to do after college? It went on. I'm sitting there with my little 15 questions, hoping to get one in. And then finally, he slowed down. It was my chance to interview him. I asked him a lot of questions, Geneva. Some must have really seemed naive and off the wall, but others he paid a lot of attention to and tried to answer as best he could. One of the questions I asked him was, I had been in Atlanta for about 24 hours when I met him. And I noticed the buses, which were legally integrated, they still look segregated. The blacks were still on the back and the whites on the front. And I said to him, Dr. King, I don't understand. The law says the buses can be integrated, but they seem still quite segregated. And he took a long breath and he said, well, Dick, change is hard for everybody. He said, if you come back here in 2 years, you'll see those buses integrated. But he said, people, black and white, we all move kind of slowly with change. So that was the first comment. During the course of my questioning, I used the word white trash and probably some other derogatory term toward white people who were segregationists. And at one point he stopped and he said, Dick, when we label people with terms like white trash, it's a way of distancing ourselves from them. And it delays the day when we will be brothers and sisters again. It's a way of objectifying another group of people. And it really doesn't lead anywhere that we want to go. Well, what surprised me with this comment is when he said we. Many people would have said, when you do something like that, that's naughty. He said we. And that has stayed with me for my lifetime. Every time someone says them, I say, well, it's probably us, in some regard, in some deep way. The telling remark that he made during our interview was when I asked about his meetings with Bull Connor and other people in Birmingham and places he had been and how hard it was to deal with segregationists. He said, well, what I've learned over time, now this is someone who's, been in the civil rights movement 6 years. So when he says over time, he's not talking 100 years. He said, over time, I've learned that if I have to say something that's really hard for someone to listen to, I should say it softly, and I should probably repeat myself. So those are the takeaways from that first interview, that we're all in this together. There's no them and us. It's always we. It makes the world a little bit more difficult to deal with, but it's a little bit more realistic, I think.
Then several years later, you met him again. And what were the circumstances of that meeting?
Well, King I was in my youth, as they say, I spent all my time in Boston in seminary for 4 years. And while there, King would come to town for this event or the other. He, of course, had gone to Boston University School of Theology. And one time at the Central Baptist Church in Cambridge, where he was to give a speech, because I was involved in some civil rights activities in Boston, we met him beforehand during a little social hour. When I say we was a group of about 30 people, mostly African Americans, but not all. And he shook our hands and talked to us. And he actually remembered me, which stunned me. I mean, I was 45 minutes and maybe an hour in his life a year and a half earlier. And he remembered my name, Dick. He said, Dick, how are you? So I was impressed with that. I've tried to be very clear in my own life that I was not a good friend of Dr. King's. I knew him, he knew my name, but we were not close buddies. Sometimes in obituaries, you'll find people saying he worked with Dr. King. He was a close confidant. I was not a close confidant of Dr. King. I had the pleasure in seeing him and meeting him and having that interview. But I think the most pivotal meeting with Dr. King in my life was not my interview, but at the time of the speech at Riverside Church. Shall I speak of that?
Please.
So during the height of the Vietnam War, Dr. King had been quiet on the Vietnam War situation, even though his wife, Coretta, in Atlanta had been active in some peaceful demonstrations against the war. So I always imagined they probably had some pillow talk about her demonstrations. But he was wrestling with the issue, even if he had not come out publicly against the war. There became a point in time where there was a big demonstration being planned for New York City, and they asked King to come and speak outside the UN. And it would be the first time in a major public way he spoke against the war. And there was a big discussion at SCLC and among SCLC's donors and allies as to whether this should take place. The argument was he should not go because it would divide the civil rights movement and it would burn a lot of bridges in Washington that spent a lot of time building with President Johnson. King wrestled and wrestled. He finally decided he had to make the speech, and he was only concerned that no one would hear what he said because there are going to be so many speakers down at the UN. At that point, I'll say this briefly. Andy Young called John Bennett, the president of the Union Seminary, the chair of my board at Clergy and Laity Concern, the national peace group that I headed at that time, and said that Dr. King would like to speak at Union Seminary about the war before he went to the UN. In other words, he wanted to get his point of view out ahead of that speech at the UN. And John Bennett said, well, if we're going to organize that, you need to call Dick because he would be in charge of doing that. So when Andy called me, and I knew Andy from some civil rights activities in the South, I said, well, why would you have it at little Union Seminary chapel that only holds about 300 people, 200 people? Why not at Riverside Church where Dr. King preaches every year? And there was a pause, and Andy said, do you think that they would let this happen? I said, well, they would be embarrassed not to. So I called John Bennett and told him the situation. And in an hour, we had the church. So that's how we got Riverside. Then I was very fortunate on my board. A board member said to me that if I needed help with the press around Dr. King's speech, I should call a guy named Fred Sontag in New Jersey, who's a professional press person. I called Fred. He agreed to work with us under two conditions. We had to have Dr. King's speech 2 days in advance, actually under that one condition. So I called Andy Young and I said, for some reason, this guy wants the speech 2 days in advance. And Andy knew exactly why he wanted it. He said, sure, we'll get him the speech. Well, it came exactly 2 days in advance, and we had a chance to edit it slightly. And then we photocopied it. This is the olden days. And we took 600 pieces of mail down to the post office in New York City and put it in the mail the night before the speech. So we did an overnight mail. So all the columnists in the country had the speech in their hand by the time King gave the speech at Riverside Church. They had written their editorials. So as good as the speech was, every newspaper in the country, we had a clipping service, every newspaper in the country except the Nashville Tennessean came out strongly against the speech. And in the Nashville Tennessean said, well, what would you expect Dr. King, a pacifist, to say about the war? Of course he's going to say that about me. Why should you be surprised? It's in keeping with his whole philosophy. We disagree with him, but we should not be surprised that would be his point of view. That speech, so he was criticized in all these newspapers exactly 12 hours after he gave it. In a couple of public occasions in the next year before he was killed, where I was present, he would say things like, I want to thank Dick Fernandez for getting me criticized in every paper in the country immediately following my speech. And he said it with a little bit of jest, but as we now know from history, that last year of his life, because of that speech, was not a pleasant year for Dr. King. The Black establishment came out and criticized him left and right. Lyndon Johnson, he never spoke again. It did break off the relationship they had, which was quite formidable. So there was a price to pay. SCLC lost money. It probably helped to kickstart a little bit the downward trend of the civil rights movement, which was already in motion, but it wasn't moving that fast. So when you talk about speeches given, I happen to think that speech was much more important to the country than the speech in 1960. I forgot the date of the
63.
63 speech, or that they were important for very different reasons. But one thing you will notice if you go to Washington in the King Memorial, there are quotes at the top of the memorial all the way around, many of his famous quotes. There is no quote from that speech at Riverside Church. The one I wanted to write up there, because it's still so true, was the one that said, the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. Well, that just wouldn't look good on that statuette, in Washington. So some things we choose to remember and many things we choose to forget, right?
Right. As you think back from this vantage point, what are your lasting impressions of Dr. King? What has stayed with you over the years?
The first thing is his humanity. First of all, Dr. King had no interest in leading the civil rights movement. He had just gotten to the Dexter Church. He had delivered, apparently, after being there a few months, a long paper on things he wanted to change. And when he was first asked by Ralph Abernathy and Fred Shuttlesworth to lead the Improvement Association, he said no. He was asked in his office. A month later, when he was nominated by a member of his church from the floor of the Improvement Association, he said yes. So what happened in that month, I have no idea. I never asked. So the first thing is, people ask, where are the Dr. Kings? Well, first you have to have a social movement, and then you have to ask somebody. I mean, that's one of my learnings. I mean, they just don't occur. But when young people ask me, where is Dr. King today? My answer is everywhere. Everywhere. In all the movements around the world, his name is uttered with terrific reverence and awe and appreciation. Now, we don't have a Dr. King on the front page of the paper like we did, but that's not the fault of Dr. King. That's the fault of our movement. Social movements are hard to crank up, and they have a lifespan, and they die down, and they crank up again. And one thing that I notice as a now 88-year-old, the activist organizations, the nonprofit, the churches today are so many more than when I was a young person. When I got out of seminary or college, if I wanted a job in an activist organization, I could try maybe the ACLU if I was a lawyer, but there weren't many jobs. The American Friends Service Committee, you could name the groups. Well, in Philadelphia alone, and I'm sure other towns and cities are like this, the nonprofit world has just expanded and expanded. And a lot of those groups have take a lot of their leanings from the work that Dr. King did in the community and around the country for many years. So he is with us.
Okay. Anything else that has shaped your life or your faith about Dr. King?
Well, you know, sometimes I'm asked, what would Dr. King do if he were here today? And I always say, well, he'd probably be in an old person's home someplace on a rocking chair. You know, people don't live on forever. I don't think. I'm pretty sure of that. And so lasting impressions. I think there are several, and I've mentioned a couple. The first, beginning at the beginning, along life's journey, in order to be a leader like King, you have to make a lot of difficult decisions. And although the decision to come out against the Vietnam War was difficult, he had other decisions before that. He had to make a decision as a young man whether he wanted to follow his father into Ebenezer Baptist Church or go out on his own. He decided to go out on his own. Then he had to decide while he was in seminary if he was going to marry a white woman, because he dated a white woman who was a student at Moore College of Art in Philadelphia. He met her through the woman who ran the kitchen out of his seminary. And for 2 years, all of his buddies kept telling him, Martin, you can't do this. You cannot go south with a white woman and be a pastor. And he just didn't pay any attention to them until his senior year. And he finally came to, we would say now, his senses, and told her in so many words. And I saw one interview with her in print that he just said, we can't do this. So that's not an easy. Can you remember back in college, if you had a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a mate, and having for vocational reasons to say, I can't do this. Not an easy decision. The easiest decision he made, which I find really interesting and uplifting, is the decision to marry Coretta Scott King. They both described their first date as the most energetic first date one can imagine, talking about the world and the civil rights and activism. And he was quite taken with her. I was also impressed, as I said earlier, with the business of whenever you're in any kind of a struggle, do not objectify the enemy if you really want to convert them at the end. Say things, if you have to say something hard that someone's going to have a difficult time listening to, say it softly and don't be afraid of repeating it.
Right. Did Dr.
I would say,
King,
let me tell you the other thing that, of course, is at the time that I interviewed him, I thought I wanted to be a minister. That's where I was headed. What meeting him made me want to do is do the work I've done on an interfaith basis, trying to look at issues that are bothersome to the country or to the people, and try to rectify that. I have tried to get jobs in local churches, but that's never panned out. So I've been doing the ecumenical interfaith thing for all my years.
Good. Well, that sounds like he really made a big impact. He shaped
Yeah.
your life in a way.
Yes, yes.
Yes. Anything else that you'd like to say for the good of the celebration that we're having today, 60 years after the March on Washington?
I think it's so important to mark these days. I'm also the person that believes that when you're in the middle of a struggle of whatever kind, it can be over teachers' wages, it can be over anything, that when you have a little success, it is time to take a break and celebrate. Just go out for coffee, do something to celebrate. Don't let it pass, because the victories are often few and far between, and you have to mark them. This occasion was a big victory. There were 3,000 members of the working press in Washington on that date in August. To those of us who were there, it felt like a big Sunday afternoon picnic after church. But I'm also aware back home in Boston and other places around the country, white people thought that all those black people were going to go going to have a race ride in Washington. And Lyndon Johnson was petrified about what all these black people in one place would do. Well, those of us who were there on that bright sunny day, it was like it was a Sunday afternoon service with a lot of the preachers, a lot of music, good music, and a lot of friendships developed. So
That's wonderful to end on that note.
yeah, yeah.
Thank you so much for your willingness to do this, Dick.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the United Church of Christ for doing this.
Sure.
Yeah.
You take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.